Welcome to the Double Down Pod. This is a very special episode because I think I'm going to be talking to someone who would I would have loved to have as a professor when I was doing my graduation in physics. Unfortunately, it's about 25 years too late. But I, when I first spoke to him, I was motivated to go back to my science books, read, and then look at the development that had happened and what Professor Satya, who we are talking to today, was doing in context of that physics and science and technology. So I'm really excited to have Professor Satya here joining us for this edition of Double Down Pod. Welcome, Professor Satya.
Thank you so much, Chennai.
Awesome. And Professor Satya, as I mentioned to you, this is something that we are doing from a double down perspective, as the name suggests.
Mhm.
I wanted to make sure that we start to unpack some of the fantastic work that you're doing. But before all of that, let's start with Professor Satya Chakravarthy before he became a professor as a kid. What were you like, and what were the things that kind of dominated your life during that time, both as an academic and as a person?
Right. So, so we have to remember that I'm a fairly old guy, which means that I grew up in the pre 1990s era. As if you were to think about India in two parts, the pre
Right.
1991, post pre liberalization and post liberalization.
Right.
Opportunities were fairly limited back then. I came from a fairly modest background in terms of, like, let's say, a lower middle class in a city, though. I just grew up in
Right.
Chennai. Um, I was mostly artistically inclined, so I used to actually draw and sketch quite a bit. I did learn to play classical Indian, South Indian classical music on the violin as well.
Wow.
I used to be about a second or third in the class all the time. There was one girl who was always getting the first rank, and we would let her do it, do that, and we're still great friends. um,
Fantastic.
so
Maybe you can do a duet sometime.
yeah, I think that's how I grew up, pretty much.
Okay. Right. What about your academic interest, right? Like, when did you start falling in love with science the way, you know,
Yeah, I
you
think
probably?
looking back, I think I was actually I didn't take I wasn't really belaboring studying, but I did like what I was listening to in the classroom. I was
Mhm.
actually a serious student in that sense. Like I was taking whatever I was learning pretty seriously. Would I try to understand it and so on, not just mug it up, vomit back in the test and so on. Did try to understand what was going on. Maybe I had fairly good set of teachers, or maybe I made the best use of them, or whatever it is. But I did enjoy every moment in the class, listening to the teachers and stuff. Of course, I did have my share of doing mischief in the classroom and with my friends in the back seat and so on. But
Right.
yeah, I think I was a fairly good student. Yeah.
Did you ask a lot of questions of your teachers in the class?
I did. I did sometimes. In fact, back I don't know what's the current generation like, but back then, if you ask questions to the teacher might actually take offense, right?
Hmm.
So it's important for you to come across as a good student in the first place. In which case,
Right.
the teacher actually picks students to ask questions in the hope that she would
Right.
get an answer, and I was one of
Right.
those. So
Okay. So establish the trust and then figure out if you can
right, exactly,
indulge.
exactly.
Right. Without questioning the knowledge.
Huh. Yeah. So you kind of have to tactfully position yourself.
Right. No, no, I can relate to it. I had some of that issue very early on in my academic journey as well, and I paid the price with a nice slap from my teacher.
Yeah, it's not
Those days, yeah, those
it's
days, those was, the carrot and the stick was more stick and less of carrot.
lots of carrot.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. 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 And then how did you? So when you were kind of in that zone, when did it kind of become clear to you that you would want to go to IIT?
Oh yeah. So I think a lot of people, even today, I come across some of them, but I think a lot of people in my generation did not know what was an IIT until we stepped out of school,
Hmm.
or around that time, right? So
So
and
get
and
serious in lifetime.
and I think even today, many students actually have this dilemma about having to spend time for JEE prep versus having to actually focus on your school boards,
That's
right?
right.
And we went through that dilemma. I did. I mean, my school was not very encouraging of anything other than boards, because if you were to actually get some all India ranks, it'll be brownie points for them. That's what they thought.
Right.
They did not think of making mileage out of IIT seats at that
Hmm.
time. So I was just going with what our principal would say, just follow the boards and stuff. And then at the end of it, I wasn't actually left with too many choices. And then I decided, hey, wait a minute, didn't look like I was actually getting anywhere with just
Hmm.
getting some fairly good marks in the boards. So I actually then sat and prepared for the JEE all by myself, outside of the 12th standard. So I actually sat for one more year and went for JEE preparation. And of course, I did that fairly by myself, except for I think having a physics teacher. Couldn't
Hmm.
get a maths or a chemistry teacher, and I used to just study by myself. So by around, let's say, for example, the JEE, at that time we had only one JEE, the JEE Advanced, what we now
Right.
call JEE Advanced. It was sometime in May, and sometime by about February, there was some kind of a transformation. I felt that I had fallen in love with the problem solving, and I was relishing just doing that, getting up at like 4 a.m. in the morning, working till about 10 p.m., 10:30 or later, and I was engrossed in it, and uh, I said that the process. Sometimes these people say things like that the journey is more important than the destination, those kinds of
Right.
things. Yeah, I did
Hmm.
feel those, and I felt like the joy of problem solving was more important than having to worry about whether I can crack the GE or not. And then
Hmm.
that it also kind of translates to what they say about don't worry about the results, you just put in your effort, right? All of that
Right.
stuff kind of started dawning on me around that time, and I enjoyed the grueling times of having to do so much problem solving, working hard at the exam. Yeah.
Wow, wow. And that time I'm assuming also that it was not like a motivation for a career. It was still kind of that problem solving thing, that this is a line of pursuit of knowledge that I want to go after. Or was it something that, hey, if I crack IIT, I'll get a fantastic job and I can do something else? And what was the
Yeah.
thought process there?
Yeah, I think different students actually have different attitudes about this. People who
Right.
are actually aware of what an IIT would do will probably look at what's it in for me if I crack IIT and so on. But
Right.
there's a large population which is just doing this simply because they just got into it.
Hmm.
And there's also misconceptions that a physics or a maths or a chemistry is all about these problems to be solved, when in reality there could be lots of concepts to learn. Research is very different from this kind of a quick problem to solve, no matter how tough it is,
Right.
and so on. So we get this kind of an illusion that if you're actually good at problem solving in physics, you're going to become a physicist, right?
Hmm.
And yeah, all of those. I mean, as a just a post high school student, I went through all of those illusions.
Yeah, so those are questions. I'm sure like your friends and family would have some opinion as well at that time, right?
Well, being like a lower middle class family that we were, both my parents actually did not go to college at all, and they had absolutely no view about what I was going to do, and they just
Hmm.
completely let me do what I wanted to do. So I was on my
Amazing.
own pretty much. Yeah.
We have to be grateful to them. So
Probably
I think
yes.
that is,
In fact,
yes.
I will dial to kind of something similar about IIT Madras much later.
Okay. No,
In
no,
this,
absolutely. I think what you I feel that is a very important nuance, because it's like there can be positive pressure and there can be negative pressure.
correct.
And I think you didn't have both, maybe to begin with. At least the positive side was that you had the freedom to kind of do whatever you wanted, and you decided your own direction.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah,
Fantastic, fantastic. And in terms of just if I may ask around, when you got through the JE part,
yeah,
how was the feeling to kind of, and when you had to kind of choose, right? I think that you still kind of had to figure out based on the rank what
correct.
stream you're going to do. I were you kind of able to get a stream of your choice, or something else came up and then you had to decide?
I think the only person who actually gets a stream of his choice, theoretically speaking, is all India number one, right? So
Right,
everybody else kind of like tailors their expectations to, what their rank would fetch them. I
right,
got the 835th rank out of 2,000 people, approximately. Right? I mean, there was only about 2,000 ranks that were published around that time, maybe a little
right,
bit more, 2050 or something like that, right? So, I mean,
right,
we don't really keep track of the later ranks, but it's kind
right,
of there.
right.
And so the 835th rank was slightly lower than what chemical engineering would do at IIT Madras, but
Okay.
aerospace engineering was well within reach. I could have also opted for metallurgy. I could have opted for civil engineering. I could have opted
Right.
for architecture. I could have opted for lots of other, chemical engineering in Kharagpur maybe, and so on. So lots of such options existed. For all
Hmm.
of these things, I felt that aerospace engineering at IIT Madras was the best choice that I would go for, and that was
Hmm.
my first choice, and I got it. So in that sense, um, I did equal the All India rank one in getting my first choice. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. And was there like a competition between any other IIT in your mind? Like, if it was not IIT Madras, was
Well,
that
yeah,
a first preference because of
yeah. So again, my parents would obviously want me to be in Madras because that's our hometown. That
Right.
was one thing. That is one thing that is kind of like a little pressure. But in my mind,
Hmm.
I was not bothered about it. I was basically looking at what's the best thing to do, and it's a combination of the campus and the discipline. But in reality, I think all of those things don't. I mean, in hindsight, all these things don't really matter, right?
Hmm.
You can do whatever you want, wherever you want, and you can still do very well, or you may not do very well.
Right.
It depends on how you are able to shape up yourself over time.
Right.
None of these
Right.
things really occur to you when you're confronted with having to make a choice, and you think that that's actually a huge turning point in your life, and so on. In reality, nobody
Right.
cares, including yourself.
Right.
Right. I thought that aerospace engineering was cool. So I just went for it. And
Interesting.
Madras still is actually the best aerospace engineering school in the country. Yeah.
Right, right. So did you have a chance to kind of get some feedback from maybe senior students, or did you have an idea that this has a great
So
atmosphere for aerospace engineering?
at a late stage, I discovered that my own uncle was actually an IIT Madras alumnus. I had not bothered about it. Didn't bother to know. So
All
once
in
I
the
got
family.
yeah, once I got got through the GE, I went and asked him, "Hey, it looks like you actually went to that school long back.
Good.
What do you think?" And he said, "Yeah, yeah, sure, sure. I think aerospace is pretty good. I know a lot of people who did aerospace because he was in Bangalore, and
Right.
Bangalore was a hub of aerospace even back then." And
That's right.
he said, "Yeah, yeah, sure, sure. Go ahead for it." And
Fantastic.
that's the only
Fantastic.
validation that I got. Yeah.
Okay, got it, got it. And like, how was the experience like at for 4 years at IIT Madras doing aerospace engineering? Right. What were the highs and what were the lows?
Very interesting about specifically about the class that I belong to, right? So I don't know what was about it. Of course, I mean, each of us has only one life, and we don't have like parallel lives and all that stuff. So I can't tell you how another class, which was a senior or a junior, would have been. But I've had
Right.
opportunities to just look at them from a distance and check it out. But we were actually a very small class. Back
Right.
then, the number of people who actually got in at aerospace engineering was about 19. And then
Right.
uh, over the course of the first year, a lot of people would drop out for multiple reasons. And then we were actually stuck with about 14 people, right? And then, so the classroom was just about two rows, seven. seven students in each row. That's it. It's a very, very small classroom. So you can never be a
Okay.
backbencher truly.
So you had the ideal student teacher ratio that
I mean,
time by
yeah,
default.
even today, IITs really strive for a very good faculty to student ratio, right? So that's something.
Hmm.
So the goal was that we should actually be able to make eye contact between the teacher and the student. In fact, aerospace engineering was like so nerdy that I think the first taste of the actual department course that we had was when, I mean, IIT Madras campus is actually very large, right?
Yeah.
And one afternoon
Right.
we had to actually go for the class right after lunch, and it was raining. And
Right.
we all thought, I think we just missed the class. It just said it occurred to all of us together. So we did a
Right.
mock bunk, right? And then this was a Friday afternoon, 1 o'clock, I remember. So the next time the class happened was Monday at 10 a.m. And the professor came and just gave a huge, shouting, saying, "I just came here all the way after lunch, bicycling for you." Back then, professors used to bicycle a lot more
Wow. Right.
as the
Right.
students, and you guys were not there. And then we said that, "Sir, it was raining in the hostel, so we couldn't come." I said, "What are you bluffing? It didn't rain here." So, which is true, right? So parts of the campus would rain, parts of the campus wouldn't rain because it is such a large
Right.
campus, right?
Right.
And that was actually the taste of the department for us. Like we just can't
Yeah.
goof up, be goofy with our professors.
Right.
They would actually expect us to straighten up, and so on. So we
Right.
really shaped up, and then we became like an extremely nerdy batch. In fact, 9 out of 14 of us actually have PhDs now, and pretty much I think all of them, include all 14, are into technical fields. None of them switch to software or management or finance or banking or any of those things, right? They're all
Wow.
sticking to engineering, core engineering, right? That
Right.
tells how tight knit our class was. It's pretty amazing, the outcome
Right.
of what we were. So
Right.
we used to have like late night sessions. In fact, most of it actually used to happen in my room. So
Hmm.
I used to have some kind of a makeshift blackboard where I could, write equations and derive and solve problems. And some of the weaker students would actually gather around me to prep for the exams. So my way of preparing for the exam was to teach. Uh,
Oh.
that's when I learned that I was actually a good teacher.
Oh.
And yeah, so and then I kind of honed my ambitions to become a teacher ultimately.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. On that point, Professor Satya, do you see a difference today? Obviously, like you said, 14 kind of went on to do PhDs and in their specific
Nine out
domains
of
of interest. And
Yeah.
9 out of 14, 9 out of 14. I'm sure that number has changed today, right? Like, is that number very
No, no. I
different?
think
Two.
even
Yeah.
in our times, that number was actually fairly large. I mean, will probably expect. I mean, there are two levels, right? So people who go just for higher studies to do a master's, and people who actually
Right.
go on to do a PhD.
Right.
So back then, the number of people who would actually go for higher studies would be like about 80%, but not necessarily going on to completing a PhD. Whereas
Right. Right.
our class was unique even back then about the PhDs. But now, I think you have a good question to ask, which is probably the number of people who are even going for higher studies is maybe 20%. I don't know, but it's fairly
Hmm.
low. It's not
It's fairly low, right?
it's fairly low.
And then the PhDs kind of also drop off the radar, right?
Correspondingly. But
Yeah. So yeah.
the total number is large enough, right? So and then sadly, most of them actually go to the US for higher studies, and the
Right.
US population has remained about the same, through this period. So
Right.
I think India has unfortunately been able to feed the required number of PhDs all through, even though the
Hmm.
percentage within India has dropped. Yeah.
Right, right, right. I would say starting from the masters to all the way to the PhD, I think we have probably been the biggest supplier of talent.
Well, it used to be the Chinese. Now it could
Hmm.
be actually Iranians as well, Iranian,
Right,
Turkish, and so on.
right.
Indians, I think Indians doing PhD has come down. Yeah, I think so.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I
That's
don't
something
have
that I think.
data, but that's a sense that I get. Yeah.
Got it, got it. And so so even for you, I think so when you kind of finished your undergrad, uh, I think you probably decided to pursue. your masters, right? And then what was that decision making like in your mind and your time there? Coming from a lower middle class, as you said, like you went to Georgia to do
Yeah. No, there were
your
essentially three
masters.
options back then. See, I'm kind of like a very analytical, algorithmic kind of guy, right? I always
Right,
try to slot and say what are the different paths, and try to metricize, which way is more probable and all of that stuff. And
right.
then somewhere along the line, I also actually throw in a dash of my own liking that kind
Mm,
of comes a little later, because I would like to come across as a very rational guy to myself in the first place, right? I mean, it may be a bit stupid, but that's how I am.
mm,
Uh,
mm.
so I
You
had
simulate the entire thing in your head,
correct.
the
So
pros
kind
and
of
cons.
like a cold thinking without worrying about emotions, feelings, and all. And then when you're all done with the analysis, then throw in a dash of
So in
feeling,
the
and
emotion.
yeah, something like that.
Wow.
I don't know if I'm making that up, but right. But maybe I'm not. I mean, I think what I'm saying is right.
Right.
So I had three options primarily, like take up a job, or pursue management, or pursue higher studies,
Masters.
right?
Yeah.
Masters leading to a PhD.
Mm,
I think so. These kinds of paths kind of exist when you're in your third year of your 4 year degree program, but
right.
pretty soon you have to kind of narrow it down. So I did start preparing for CAT, which is the management IIM thing, and I fundamentally don't like these competitive exams at all. Like, even dialing back to the JEE, it's one thing to be doing problem solving, which I liked, but doing that against a clock, and even the problem solving is not real. I mean, you're not solving like real life problems, right? Real life problems will probably take like 2 to 3 years for you to solve, or 5 years to solve, or whatever it
Right. The
is.
serious big problems, right? That
Right,
right.
right. So I don't like these abstract, cooked up kind of problems that you need to solve against a clock. These are definitely rat races, in my
Mm,
view. So halfway through preparing for CAT, I was like, why am I going through this? And that
right.
was kind of like deciding it for itself. But I was also interning with my professors. I did some couple of student interns, bit more than what my other colleagues, my friends were doing. And I was actually getting sucked into more and more of aerospace engineering. I did a project with my professor here on a something to do with solid rockets for ISRO,
Hmm.
and he had a consulting project. And then I was also interning in the summer, working as an undergraduate research assistant in the lab, burning solid propellants and so on. So I did
Right.
gainfully spend my time around, because I mean, uh, one thing, being a local person was very helpful, because even if the hostels were shut down, if the messes were shut down, I could still come from home and so on. So
Hmm.
all of that stuff helped, or at least I made best use of it. So I had an opportunity to dive deeper into outside of classroom engagement in aerospace, and that helped kind of shape me towards that particular direction of trying
Right.
to go for higher studies.
Fair enough. We'll come back to this higher studies part, but I think I'm just the question that kind of pops in my head is that the pipeline from IIT Madras into Bangalore, and let's say the extended world of ISRO, HAL, and those kind of organizations that probably had room to accommodate aerospace graduates in India at that point in time. Was that kind of well defined at that point in time?
Not at all. Not at all. I think it wasn't very well defined, even ever. As a matter of fact, uh,
Hmm.
the what I understood was the ISROs of the world, HALs of the world had their own mechanism of finding people to join them, and they
Right,
would impart training after people join them. And aerospace engineering was actually only one part of what they needed. They needed a lot more mechanical engineers, electrical engineers. ISRO needed quite a few chemical engineers, and so
right,
on. Uh, Aerospace engineering, as such, is a very specialized course, right? So
right.
they probably thought that you don't need exactly aerospace engineers at all, and there weren't too many colleges that were offering aerospace engineering anyway. So
Right.
they were actually happy taking other streams, people from other colleges, and then impart training. And HAL, for example, had a very vibrant what's called as management trainee program with IIT Madras, where IIT Madras would train their the people who joined them, and so on.
Right.
So that was their attitude and approach to recruitment. Whereas I don't think the IITs really figured in the radar pretty much.
Hmm. Interesting. Interesting. So now maybe coming back to your continued journey. So you kind of go to Georgia Tech, right? And you kind of land up in your
Well,
masters.
even there, I
What's
think I
the
just want to, yeah, I just
yeah,
wanted to intervene there. So
yeah.
many times, actually, a student, when he or she thinks of higher studies, they sort of have a default that it will be the US, right? Particularly from
Hmm.
IITs, right?
Right.
Whereas
Right.
the rational guy that I am, I wanted to actually make it like a proper choice. So I did apply to IISc, I did apply to IIT Madras, and I got through all of them. I did get
Hmm.
to Georgia Tech, and then I had actually a choice to make among all these three. And then I said, okay, fine. Among all these three, I think Georgia Tech makes a better choice, made a better sense for good reason. Because what happened is, um, when you start the application process, you write to professors expressing interest in working with them, and some of them
Right.
respond, some of them don't. The Georgia Tech professor that I actually worked with responded saying that he's retiring after because he was actually hitting 70, and therefore he
Hmm.
will not be able to take me. But I still went ahead and applied because I could get to some other professor,
Hmm.
and so I got the admission, I got the financial aid. I was actually state funded, and then this gentleman actually writes back to me saying, I have actually decided to become a professor emeritus. I'm actually continuing. The Office of Naval Research is funding me. So
Hmm.
if you want to still work with me, you can write to the graduate school saying you don't want their state funding, and instead I would actually be able to fund you, right? And this gentleman was actually the oldest rocket scientist in the world, and
Wow.
that's something that I realized only when he actually wrote back to me again, and
Right.
I dig a little bit deeper and find out like who is he, right, and then so on. So hands down, it was not just Georgia Tech, just US kind of a mania, but working with the Edward Price was actually super important for me.
Right. Right. Right.
That
Were you kind of blown away that he came back to you? You were not. He was not. There was no obligation on him to come back to you. You were a student in India. Maybe you've written a very good essay or a cover letter at that point in time.
I had a fairly decent resume. I had all these
Right.
this thing, what do you call, summer internships and other
The
engagement
credentials. Yeah.
credentials. So and fairly good academic record as well. So
Right.
it's possible that he actually found me the best among anybody
Right.
that he came across. But yeah, I think I was in cloud nine.
Right. And I think this is a common theme that I also kind of have heard from so many others who've kind of gone on and done masters in my friend circle and PhDs, that it's also the involvement from the person you're going to do the PhD under, and how that matchmaking happens, that kind of qualifies and locks that decision, right? And uh, that process in itself is kind of so fascinating, in that you were going to work with someone who's also wanting to learn together with you and maybe discover new things, research new areas, that essentially they're hiring a research assistant rather than somebody to come in and do a just a master's degree and then go away for something else.
Absolutely. I think there are a couple of metaphors to describe the relationship between a PhD advisor and the PhD student.
Right.
While they are doing a PhD, it's actually more like a wedlock. And of course, we won't get into designing genders between the two people on who dominates who and all that stuff. But
Right.
right, but it's actually a wedlock. That means that you are extremely sincere in this relationship, both ways. I think the PhD advisor has to give time to the student, as well as the student has to actually follow up with the advisor on what needs to be done. And there's also a transformation that happens. Initially, the student does not know what to do. At some point, the student actually knows more than the
Right.
advisor on his topic of research. that's when he is actually ready to get a PhD. Right.
Right.
So this kind of a transformation happens over a 3 to 4 year period. If you're actually good at it, if you're really working hard, and so on, which is something that happened to me. So my advisor was extremely, respectful and regarding of me as we went along. But initially there was like a honeymoon, and of course the honeymoon never ended in my case,
Right.
but thankfully for me, we were actually
Right.
a very good pair between me and my advisor. The next metaphor that happens after you graduate is one of a father and son, or an academic
Parent and
yeah.
a child. Yeah.
Okay, so we talk about like academic lineage, right? So and
Mm.
so was my grandfather, and so on, right? The professor's PhD advisor becomes like your academic grandfather and all that stuff, right?
Right.
So they do have that kind of a metaphor as well. So
Right.
yeah, I mean that's how it is. It is actually, in some sense, I used to think back and say, wait a minute, at the PhD level, it's actually almost like a gurukul system, right? Because ultimately people have to learn from their guru, and
Right.
at PhD level is ultimately where the West actually practices something very close to a gurukul system.
Right, right, right. And I think this is again, I'm just reflecting back to some of the experiences that I have also heard and I've seen. You know, and, professors used to open up their houses for their students to come in,
Yeah,
serve them meals. Not asking for a single thing in return,
yeah.
and just kind of giving. I think this giving attitude, which you talk about from a
So
gurukul perspective, I think all they want is that
because
sincerity for you to learn and then take on the legacy forward and do something,
absolutely,
fascinating in that field.
absolutely, all of that stuff has happened with me and my advisor. Yes, yeah,
Right, right, right. So you have like a parental relationship, that almost that level of gratitude that I think you would have. So and that also kind of serves as an inspiration. So once you experience this, then you're saying, okay, now I'm committed to solving some problem and going after this problem. So I want to be at the pinnacle of, academic research. I want to go into this area and charter into the unknown, and then
yeah.
figure this whole thing out. And that is exactly how your PhD also kind of came around. Like it was a no brainer for you to just continue into your PhD.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? So see, so you look at what I am, right? When I finished my school, I didn't know what was IIT, right? When I was getting into Georgia Tech, I didn't know what I was stepping into.
Right,
So they give an I-20 for your F1 visa, and
right.
Georgia Tech was very conservative. They paid very less back then, right? I don't know if they still do.
Even though it was in dollars, right?
Yeah,
So
right, that's right. And then for Midtown Atlanta, it's pretty expensive to live in, right?
yeah, yeah.
So
Maybe save. You should have saved the dollars then, because now it's a fantastic value every day.
never expected that. Yeah, but we had to spend the money at that time, right? So anyway,
Right,
but the I-20 basically said it's a 1 year master's, right? But the moment I actually met my advisor, he was actually talking about a PhD. So my
mm,
my mother thought I'm actually going to come back after 1 year looking at the I-20. But the first thing that happened with my advisor was that he was talking about me staying there for at least about 4 years, and that didn't. I mean, at that particular moment, it didn't even surprise me. I said, "Yeah, sure. I mean, why not? I mean, that's how we want to
why not?
uh, go
Right,
through this." And kind of slipped into the PhD.
right,
For good measure, I did get my master's in 1 year, as
right,
was planned, and continued on with my PhD program, and finished it in about 4 years, all the way from the bachelor's. That is, in 3 more years, I actually finished my PhD. Yeah.
right,
So yeah, it was actually a fast track PhD. Worked really, really super hard to get there. So a lot of hardworking ethics is something that I actually picked up during my PhD. I found my own limits of how hard I can work, and so on. Yeah.
right, right. And
And the
and what
other
about
thing,
the Yeah, go
I
ahead,
think
please.
you asked about one more point which occurred to my head. Since my advisor was actually like world renowned, I mean there was a time when I was in his office discussing our research, and there was a Korean who actually dropped in, and he said that he was actually a tourist in Atlanta. He went to the Coke Museum and all that stuff. In addition to that, he also actually wanted to take a picture with my advisor. So my advisor was like that well known in that community of
God,
rockets.
OG.
Correct, exactly,
Yeah,
right? So and these things were like goosebumpy stuff for me. And
right,
sure enough, when I was finishing my PhD, among the U.S. rocket community, I was seen as a emerging star. So they were actually interested in absorbing me in different places and all that stuff. So I did get actually about from 4 postdoc offers. But of course, my advisor said, "You're not going anywhere." So the good thing about him was that whenever I got a postdoc offer, he actually bumped up his own offer by $1,000. So
It's like you want to retain that talent. You don't want to let go.
I mean, he's also kind of like emotionally appealing to me, which is sort of unusual for an American. But as a
Right.
usual American, he actually did
No,
the
but
thousand.
I'm not surprised, Professor Satya, because I've heard this story from many people. From the '60s to today, about professors and this culture in the US, and it's not like glorifying the US culture, like you said, it's mostly akin to our gurukul,
Correct.
thought process. I think it's the sincerity both sides
Correct.
that kind
I
of
I think
reflects
I
in
think
that
I think
relationship.
the quest for knowledge is what binds us. To be honest, yeah,
Quest for knowledge, that's the keyword. That's the
yeah.
keyword. And what role do resources play in this spectrum, Professor Satya? Because I think the other thing that also kind of think through a lot, right? Like, when you talk about research facilities, and we'll kind of come back to IIT Madras in a while. uh, you know the US universities kind of well endowed, they invest ahead of the curve, they put in those resources. Obviously there is, the government grants come in, there are endowments that come in, there are other institutions, philanthropy that come in to kind of push the lever forward, and they know they're kind of venturing into the unknown. Like, was that something that you found when you were in Georgia Tech? Did you have all those resources that you needed to pursue your academic interests?
Yeah, at the time when I was in Georgia Tech, yes, I did definitely have more resources than what I could see IIT Madras had or lacked. Um, but I think that gradient has actually vanished today, particularly in
Right.
areas where there are faculty members like myself who actually take the effort to bridge the gap and get these resources put in the
Right.
facilities. For example, just
Right.
go to momentarily fast forward to the NCCRD, that's actually the best in class combustion
Right.
research facility in the world.
Right.
So it is possible to command resources within India if you have a focus and say, I want to actually develop this to be a world class facility. And
Right.
we have had uh,
Right.
professors from Georgia Tech actually come and envy us for that, right?
Got it.
And
Got it.
yeah, yeah. So
Got it.
it's doable. It's not as if like
It's
we need
doable.
to
It
always.
is doable. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't. In
Absolutely.
fact, the
Absolutely.
people like GE Aviation have worked very closely with us, simply because we have the facilities as well as the caliber, just as well as anywhere
Right.
else,
Right.
even
Right.
better,
Yeah.
many times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll come to that. But just one question, Professor Satya, before I kind of wrap up your journey in the US and then come back to India. It's, you know, again, I'm trying to kind of unpeel your decision making, right brain versus left brain process here. Right? You had offers coming from places. This was the best rocket scientist that you were trained under. Why did you not land up in a place like NASA, or in Caltech doing something else, or any of the California JPLs, all those institutions that we know were kind of building rockets and sending them to space? ISRO still had like very few things to talk and claim at that point in time versus today.
Correct. So everything takes its own time, and life moves on. So in my case, my approach was to have a default option and keep working at it, and evaluate any other opportunity that comes against this option to see if it is better or worse. And then
Right.
if it is worse, then I'll actually stick to my default option. If it is better, then I would switch to what that being the default option. It's kind of like a computer program, right? So I have like this algorithmic approach to life. So my default option was to actually come back to teach at IIT Madras. And the reason for that is I enjoyed those days when I was teaching my
Friends
classmates
and
the night before the
yeah.
exam. I actually admire, in fact, a lot of my classmates, being those nerds, did think of actually coming back to IIT Madras to teach, because we felt
Hmm.
that the professors had a very great life. They were teaching these bright kids, and then they had a otherwise a very relaxed life and so on. But the relaxed life part actually stopped being alluring to me, because I had learned how to do hard work in Georgia Tech. So I was actually this working machine, a working and thinking machine. That's so many times we have this contrast between, like, if you're working so hard, you're not thinking, hard enough. You're not cerebral enough. You're actually kind of like a slave labor, and so on.
Mechanical. Yeah.
Yeah. right, but that's not necessarily true. Your brain can work as well as your hands, right?
Yeah.
So I could actually get that combination right for myself. So the leisurely attitude about what I had seen during my IIT Madras student days was not something that was alluring me at all. But the goal of actually coming back to IIT Madras was still there. It was more personal. I wanted to actually be back with my parents. And I mean, I started picking up interest in Carnatic music, and started listening to a lot of music back when I was in the US. And
Hmm.
I thought I will actually have time to listen to Carnatic music in Chennai, which is actually the capital of Carnatic music. Uh,
That's right.
but sadly, I've not had the time at all. Right. So
You've
in
made a
about
different kind of music. Let's put it this way: you've made a different kind of music,
in
which
about
kind
20,
of comes through rocket boosters.
yeah, in about 27 years since I've actually come back, I would have probably attended about 5 concerts, right? So it's really pathetic that way. But so I was actually having different metrics to think of coming back to IIT Madras to teach, and I was actually preparing very well for that. I was interested in accumulating materials for teaching. Teaching the best courses and all of the stuff, which I've implemented over time, right? So I think
Hmm.
the students probably have unknowingly got enriched by the fact that there was this very enthusiastic teacher who came back. But
Right,
then the
right,
question is,
right,
what were the other opportunities, right? So the typical journey for somebody who is actually getting into rockets in the US, going from outside, is that you need to actually become a citizen. You need to become a US citizen,
right.
and then that takes a little
It's
while.
kind of defense affiliated and that kind of stuff.
Right? So that takes a little while. So unless you
Right.
have actually made that your default and then you're pursuing it, right? There
Hmm.
is a possibility that you actually get an opportunity to come back to IIT Madras sooner. And if you now have to actually evaluate the bird in hand versus a couple of them in the bush, the choice is kind of obvious, right? That's essentially what basically happened in my case, and that's the reason why I'm
Sure.
back here talking to you.
Fantastic. No, fantastic. And good luck for us. And so many things are happening just because of that one simple decision
Yeah.
that US takes longer to do that that part compared to everybody else. Okay.
Well,
So,
there are a lot of people who waited out actually.
I know they do that, right? Right. Yeah. And so, so now you kind of come back to
No,
India.
but just to let you know, right? So one of my
Yes.
seniors actually applied to IIT Madras, and it took about 3 years for him to get it, because IIT
Hmm.
Madras back then had not figured out how to take people from abroad, right? So they have
Right.
this procedure by which you have to appear for an interview in person and all
Right.
of those. So
Right.
I actually applied
Or
to
also,
IIT.
on that point, it's also going to kind of, I don't think there is a process to even take students in India from other boards other than CBSE, right?
Well, I
So
mean, yeah, yeah, probably, right? That's a different.
timing, exams, I think that's another thing that I kind of feel,
There
because then, a lot of people
are, there are rigidities about it. Yes, correct. So the
that's
point
right.
is that as soon as I finished my PhD, I applied
Yeah.
to IIT Madras, right? And
Right.
to my utter surprise, I actually got the offer within about 4 months, right? And at the same time, as just I was about leaving, I had also applied for a green card, and the US immigration actually came back to me with some questions, right? If I were to actually answer them, I would have got a green card,
Green
right?
card.
So it was like a very tight time when IIT Madras actually won the race against the US green card.
Yeah. No
So
follow-up questions. You could have probably gotten it.
I know, right? That's right. So yeah, I think these are all how fate essentially determines what you want to do. Yeah,
Right, 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 right. Fantastic. And so now you come back to India, and now there are 2 points that are very interesting. One is that you channeled your internal energy and your association with India, with IIT Madras at that point in time, and your initial dream of probably getting into the academic, professorial journey, and you came back to India. What was the atmosphere like? What were the right kind of circumstances that were available to you for initiating the journey leading up to the NCCRD? So let's talk about that, right? Like what were the trigger points? What worked for you really well? And what were the challenges in hindsight that, if they were not there, can make it a lot easier for a lot of people who go like this today and come back and do things here in academia?
correct. So, as I said, when I came back, I didn't really have great ambitions of what I should achieve. What were the benchmarks for
Right.
being a faculty and all of that stuff. It took like maybe about 6 months to 9 months or so for me to kind of get my ground on what to expect for a career over here.
Right.
So one of my colleagues was actually the guy who took 3 years to get an IIT Madras offer from Georgia Tech. So he was actually dead sure that he wanted to be like a great researcher, right, of international
Right.
repute. And we
Right.
used to have long, late evening chats and all that stuff. And then he was like, "Yeah, sure, it should be possible for us to do it from here."
Right.
But it's difficult because we don't have the international exposure anymore. We were actually having problems getting journal articles in our libraries soon enough, and so on back then. For us to be able to publish papers from sitting in India would take like much longer time than if it were in the US. So lots of things were delayed, getting funding and so on. But pretty soon we kind of found the game, right? So just keep pushing proposals to get funded and get the funding, convert them into projects, and get students to do those projects. Write the papers, go to conferences in the US and other parts of the world,
Right.
and publish them in journals. And
Right.
within about maybe about 4 or 5 years, we were actually back to become like the global level academics.
Wow.
All
So
right.
okay, this is fascinating. So this is like entrepreneurial journey begins before you become like a formal entrepreneur as we know it, right? Like this is an academic entrepreneur, and you're kind of pitching for what you want to do.
Yeah,
And and
absolutely.
and that's what a researcher. I think you mentioned somewhere in the past that that's what a researcher
I,
typically
I've
tends to
seen that
do.
up close. I've seen that up close in the US. That each professor actually is a small businessman. He has to actually push proposals and then pitch for them in different funding
Right.
agency with different funding agencies, with different
Right.
reviewers of those funding agencies, and all those committees and all that stuff. And then he has to win those
Right.
proposals, hire people. There is a budget that he has to actually operate. All of
Right.
those things is actually very similar to how you run a business, right? And I've
Right.
seen that
Right.
up close in the US, and we were actually doing exactly the same thing. So the thing about
Right.
IIT Madras was, when I was a student, IIT Madras was pretty much. So when I say IIT Madras, it's actually true for all IITs, by the way, right? So
Right.
nothing
Right.
very specific about IIT Madras.
Sure.
What I found was that IIT Madras was kind of like a undergraduate teaching institution. That's what they were priding themselves
Known for.
as.
Yeah.
They wanted to kind of transform that into making it a research institution when around the time when I was coming back. So keep in mind that I was no longer enchanted by actually having a chill life. I was actually this hardworking guy when I came back. So and just around that time, IIT Madras was also kind of upgrading, saying that dude, you
We
can't
want to
chill,
be in that direction.
right? So you have to actually be working hard to, and we aligned, right? So I kind of aligned with IIT Madras's goals. It was working out very
Right.
well. But the more important thing that I realized about IIT Madras, and this is actually a super, super important thing for any institution, is
Right.
the thing about the culture at IIT Madras is that they will not stop you from doing anything if you're doing the right thing.
Mm.
Okay.
Right.
So they had the sense, and they still do, that they have the sense that if you're doing what looks like the right thing to do, right, nobody will come and stop you.
Right.
Nobody will, they may not really go out of the way to help you, which, on the contrary, I have actually taken a lot of help from IIT Madras administration. But I'm talking about even colleagues, right? So colleagues may not necessarily come out and help you, but they will not stop you. Nobody really
Right.
stops you from doing what you want to do. In
It's a
fact, we have to go.
permissionless place. It's a permissionless place where you can take your bet, and
Correct.
you have to figure out a way to kind of make things
So when
happen.
they talk about academic freedom, I think
Right.
IIT Madras takes it super seriously.
Right.
Right.
Right. And
So
this point that you're making, Professor Satya, is this also because one of the other ingredients we obviously we talk about Professor Ashok Jhunjhunwala's contribution to IIT Madras, and then being able to create these other innovation stories out of that. Like I think in his journey also, when he landed here, he had to go through a lot of red tape and process to kind of get into that zone, right? Like, was it very important to have somebody like him in IIT Madras be ready to kind of create like a pathway for somebody like you to come in and find your home? Did you need to have somebody who was like a father figure like that in IIT Madras, and then at least allowed you that permissionless culture, or was it something that was there by default?
No, I think Professor Junwal was actually operating out of electrical engineering, and he did
Right.
have his entrepreneurial journey happen around the same time that I joined. But
Right.
he and perhaps his colleagues in electrical engineering, Professor Bhaskar Ramurthy or a few others
Right.
that were actually working with him, were a exception. And
Access.
so nobody really, and what I was trying to do at the time was to actually be a international level professor, which is to go out and get funding for my research and do the research and publish, have PhD students. The typical professor, what they would do. This is not what
Right.
Professor Jindal was actually known for at that time. So he was
Right.
actually considered a what do you call, very differently. And whereas the culture had actually transformed to not put those red tapes anymore. And they were
Right.
essentially saying, in fact, there's a very interesting anecdote that I can share. So there was
Sure.
a faculty association meeting that they had, and I attended it. And like most of the time back then, I used to actually get up and ask a question or whatever it is. So I was actually telling them, look, at IIT Madras, we seem to have a lack of mentors to young faculty, right? And then there was one faculty member, I still remember who it is, who actually got up and answered me, saying, "Be glad that you don't have anyone to mentor. You have to be glad that we are not here to torment."
Hmm.
And so he was like, if you have, I mean, you should be happy that you're left alone, is what he was
Yeah.
saying. And I was like,
Right.
wow.
Right.
And that's actually super
Absolutely.
important. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Fantastic. And so, now let's come to that entrepreneurial kind of spirit, and then your condensation of all the learnings, and then trying to be an international class professor kind of narrowed into this institution called NCCRD, right? So, story for NCCRD, like what's the journey for getting that level of infrastructure, resources, and the vision to get it done?
Right. So I think the pretty soon, within about 3 4 years of stepping into being an academic as an assistant professor,
Right.
uh, me and my colleague who used to work together, uh, we got fairly well known in the national academic circles, enough for both of us to actually independently get in successive years the Young Engineer Award with the Indian National Academy of Engineering.
Right.
So
So at
at
that
that,
point in time, just Professor Satya, sorry to interrupt, but so this recognition also has a process to it, right? So, and that kind of probably is the contribution that you made to papers and what you published at that point in time. You got cited internationally because I think you would be doing all of that stuff. So you didn't put a stop to all of that activity that
correct.
got you that recognition gradually, and then there's this validation that okay, fine, there's stuff happening, right?
Correct. So the reason why I brought that up is because we did actually get reasonably well known in the academic and the R&D circles in the country, like a ISRO or a DRDO or a DST or any of those places, right?
Right.
And that essentially set us up for the NCCRD funding opportunity. And I would say we were ready for it. We were actually more than ready for it. We knew what exactly we wanted to do if we were
Hmm.
given an opportunity. So
Right.
opportunity knocks the prepared mind, as they say. So when a lot of leaders, fairly senior ones, actually got together to realize that India needs to invest in combustion research because the world is going in the direction of an environmental problem that combustion causes, that we need to worry about in terms of developing clean combustion technologies, versus you also actually have fossil fuel shortages that might actually happen over the horizon. So you need to actually come up with alternative fuels, and these alternative fuels could actually also be cleaner in some
Right.
sense. For example, what people are talking about is hydrogen today, right? So all of these things culminated in the government itself actually wanting to be interested in combustion funding, and that we just geared up to that, right? So when the government actually came and said, "Why don't you put out a proposal for a combustion center?" Sure, we said, "Sure enough, we
You
will
were
actually."
ready with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think
Right.
I think it's again like a meeting of the opportunity versus with our preparation.
Great, great. And so maybe, this is a good time to kind of discuss a little bit in detail about the National Center for Combustion and Research and Development, right? Like, so uh, what kind of facility is this? And then how does it compare to world standard? I think it's probably one of the only ones in the world at that level, is from what I understood. I almost was outside of that facility in March, as you remember. Uh, but, tell us a little bit about that infrastructure today, and what are students, what are your teams doing there?
Right. So I think when we started out, so remember, I'm actually an aerospace combustion person. That means that
That's right.
I know how to do rockets. I know how to do maybe aircraft engines,
You're a propulsion man.
propulsion man, right? But all of a sudden, we had to actually worry about automobile combustion. We had to worry about thermal power, like coal combustion, biomass combustion, clean coal combustion, all of those kinds of gasification. So lots of things that
Right.
I wasn't aware of. So IIT Madras historically actually has been good in combustion, is what I learned sort of in hindsight. And but we were also actually having a thriving combustion community among aerospace department, mechanical engineering department, chemical engineering, and a couple of other like applied mechanics and so on.
Right.
So
Right.
so we had the possibility of bringing a lot of them together, about some 30 odd faculty members together, and ask them to pitch with their ideas on what we could do and what kind of
Right.
facilities we would like to have, and so on. And some of them actually came up with some really out of the world ideas. Like, for example, there was one of our colleagues who had actually come back from Case Western Research University in Dayton, Ohio, and his professor and he were actually working with NASA Glenn in doing drop tower experiments for microgravity combustion. Although he himself had actually got trained in only doing computer simulations of that,
Right.
but he knew he had actually seen up close how a microgravity drop tower works, and he
Right.
said, "Let's actually have a microgravity drop tower." And then one of my other colleagues,
Right.
who had actually gone to Stanford and Georgia Tech and came back, he said that let's actually have a supersonic combustion tunnel that would allow us to actually make hypersonic flight worth of combustion, like supersonic combustion ramjets for
Right.
hypersonic flights, which are futuristic, and so
Right.
on. So, and then the automobile people basically said that let's actually have industry class automobile test cells, which even the best automobile companies would envy. That we have, and then they were actually like people like Mahindra, who have like about 25 test cells, would actually envy us for having 4 cells, so that they could actually do some R&D work with us, because all
Right.
those 25 cells were used for production testing,
Right.
right?
Right.
And we didn't have opportunity to do
So you created this. So this, like, what this just seems like you're describing like a center of gravity for combustion that you ended up creating. And it starts to kind of suck in different objectives from industry, from academia, and
absolutely.
then you kind of coalesce into something bigger than what you had anticipated originally, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, in fact, there are two parts to it. One is the sheer engineering of the center,
Yeah.
in terms of like the air ducts to bring into a 5-story building for every lab and every floor, the exhaust ducts, do it in a clean manner, safe way, and lots of those things. That's the engineering, and then the
Right.
specific setups like the microgravity or the supersonic
Yeah.
combustion, the automotive test rigs, or the gasifiers. All of these things were actually sort of engineering challenges by themselves in the first place. So we really thrived in putting all of that together. The
Right.
second thing was what you said, that we were actually doing this at a scale that was relevant to the industry, because
Right.
combustion is actually a multi-physics, multi-scale process. So
Right.
it's very difficult to actually scale it down to something that's like a
Right.
bench uh, level. So
Right.
people actually pay respect to you only if you're keeping the high pressures and the high temperatures in the combustion chamber, like it happens in an aircraft gas turbine or a power generating let's say a coal gasifier or whatever it is. So we were
Right.
actually trying to replicate those exact conditions at a reasonable scale that was relevant to the industry. And
Right.
suddenly the industry basically said, hey, there's something going on here that we would be wanting to be part of. So we had like huge amount of industry research that happened at NCCRD in the last 10 years.
Right, right. And so in terms of this infrastructure coming up, and I think there is this lesson that you are also sharing, that for doing research, a vital ingredient is that some of the things will not pre-exist in the world, right? and therefore you have to go back into the science and say, hey, to create and simulate this environment in physics. So like microgravity, the only other way to do this is actually send something up in space, or near earth orbit or close, low earth orbit, and then just get that parabolic flight and then
Yeah, yeah,
simulate that microgravity. And now you're saying, okay, now the cheaper version of doing that is create a drop tower,
correct.
right? And to even build that, did you kind of build all of that in India? It's like literally, did the supply chain exist for your ambitions for NCCRD, or you had to kind of
So,
import things from outside? How did it work?
yeah, there are two parts. One is the facilities which required a lot of engineering
Yeah,
was done by us. The engineering was done by us, and the facilities were done with local support and supply chain.
right,
That wasn't a huge problem, and therefore we could actually do it in a much more cost effective manner. There is
right,
something going for Indian frugality right to the hilt. I
right,
can actually talk for all evening. So
right,
we did pull that off. But the second part was the diagnostics. So while I am setting up a combustion process and the realistic conditions that happen in engines and power plants and all that stuff, I need to still be able to actually investigate it, which means that I need to shine lasers in it. We have to put quartz windows and have lasers go through. We have to have high speed cameras that are looking at it, and we get digital data, digital images from which we actually try to squeeze data like velocity vectors and temperature maps or whatever it is.
right,
Right, a
right,
lot of laser diagnostics that has actually gone into the entire set of research, and those lasers and high speed cameras had to be imported, and
right,
that ecosystem I think still does not exist in India.
right, right. But you could actually put it down on paper and say, hey, this is what we need, and this is what, and you could get it
Correct.
all.
So
You could
we
plan
could
and
actually
source it.
so we could make a laundry list of all these things. We had the money. We could
Right,
actually command the
right,
attention of all these best laser diagnostics
right,
equipment makers, and
right.
they would
Is
stand in
it
line to actually sell it to us and so on. Yeah.
Right. Is it fair to say, Professor Satya, that there is this mental block that we have all had in India, that we can't create and can't aim for best in class facilities just because it requires money. But once you apply like a little bit of a frugal model of balancing what you can build versus what you can acquire, there are enough resources for us to put things together which are going to be actually best in class, right?
Yeah. So at the risk of sounding racist, I actually call it the brown curse.
Okay.
So yeah. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We do have this mentality that we can't do the best in the best sitting in India. That's absolutely wrong.
Right. Right. And sometimes the system also kind of works in a way that it kind of sandpapers your ambitions. I think this is the word that I like to use, that it sandpapers your ambitions, because you kind of are discouraged to not think out of the box, just by virtue of things, maybe it's just circumstantial. It's like once you kind of break through that mindset, then you can
You
you
know,
can probably
I think the way,
think big.
yeah. So I think the way I probably overcame that, if in case that's what you're actually interested in,
Right,
talking about this evening.
right,
Um, I think I don't really bring in emotions and things like frustration, all of these things into what I do, right?
right,
So I've actually had an opportunity to think back because there are multiple podcasts that I give, and people ask
right,
these kind of questions. So I have an
right.
opportunity to think back, and then in some sense, it looks like I have a Forrest Gump kind of attitude. If you have watched that
Hmm.
movie,
Yes,
you pick up something and then you just keep running with it without bothering
at
about.
it.
Yeah, right.
Right.
So, in fact, I've had my colleagues actually express a huge amount of pleasant surprise when we got the NCCRD awarded, and we got like the Center of Propulsion Technology from DRDO awarded, because I was just plain, at it with the bureaucrats, whether it is in
Right,
DST, DRDO, and so on. Just give them any piece of paper that they want next, any document that they want us to prepare, and so on. Just do this as honestly as you can, right? Absolutely no fudging, nothing. So just be bare with them,
right.
saying this is my intent, this is what we are doing, and this is where we are, and we can do this, and so on. So in some
Yeah,
sense it might look like hustling, but it's actually much more credible hustling than what you might come
yeah.
across with young
I think
entrepreneurs.
that's the keyword. That is the keyword, that credible hustling has value every time, anytime, everywhere.
Yeah.
And especially in entrepreneurship, it comes like really, really handy, because in that case, you don't have another choice.
Yeah. No, I've actually gone through moments where, for example, you typically deal with a scientist in a DST or a DRDO, right? So they actually understand what you're talking about and they want to support, right?
Right,
But ultimately, there is this lady who has been posted from the finance ministry to these places, who has the
right,
toughest of questions to ask you,
right,
okay? Because she's the one who is actually holding the purse strings in that ministry, right?
right,
And I don't know why it's always a lady I've actually come across, but it's probably like she's the Lakshmi of the the department or whatever it is. But
right,
she asks like extremely probing questions on, are you really sure you want to do this? Are you really sure this is going to fetch you somewhere and all
right,
that stuff? You have to look in the eye and then give a very credible answer saying, hey, this is what I am, this is where we are, this is where we have reached, this is our stature in the world, and this is what we have done so far, and this will actually make a huge difference, and so on. So you should be able to educate people very credibly,
right,
and that's what I have done.
right, 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 right. Excellent. So we'll switch gears now, Professor Satya, and I want to kind of move into the entrepreneurial part of your life now, because it does seem like things are stacking up and building blocks are stacking up so far in the conversation, in terms of how everything has added value to you there. And at some point in time, I'm hoping to kind of come back to lessons learned. But now, when you look at your journey, right, again, I think now I know the roots for why you are involved with 5 or 6 companies at the same time. You are leading ePlane, but you're also involved with everybody else. And then in this movement of NCCRD, which kind of became the birthplace for about 3 or 4 of those companies in a way, and I think they're probably researching still there. And then the IIT Madras campus in Tayur, right? This conversation kind of leads into that direction, right? Like, what kind of, you had the freedom, you did the academic freedom, you kind of pursue the academic journey in parallel, and then when did you decide to kind of turn entrepreneur? Like, that was a moment where you said, okay, now I'm a professor who's going to build a business.
Yeah. So while I was actually a researcher, I was this Forrest Gump kind of researcher, just doing research. I used to love working with the industry, but we also actually had a lot of what would I call it, as a blue sky research, research for its
Hmm.
sake, seeking knowledge, those kinds of things. In fact, most
So
of my
fundamental research.
fundamental research. So those were the things that will actually tickle our the brain cells and stuff. And I was actually kind of far from entrepreneurship in that sense, right? So um, but as we went along, there were a few things that happened. Number one, we were doing these things at massive scale at NCCRD. So my question is, if I were to actually put the efforts into engineering products that have a commercial value with the same
Right,
amount of detail as we have actually put into the engineering of the setups that we have established, the processes that we are investigating for my research, we could actually have a
right,
gainful impact in the society. So that's
right,
that's one thing that occurred to me. The second thing that happened was that there were students like the co-founder of Aerospace, Rohit, actually came up to me and said that he wanted to make a microgas turbine, and I was
right.
actually receptive to it. In fact, the other co-founder that I brought together with Rohit was Pradeep, who had come to me about 8 years before, when I was an associate professor and before NCCRD was set up. And he had told me that he
Hmm.
wanted to make gas turbines, and I told him that it's super difficult to do. Just get out of here. Don't waste my time. I want to be doing research instead of building products. But
So
fast
you
forward,
tormented him at that time.
right? So fast forward 8 years, we have been through the NCCRD, these massive setups and experiments and all of those things. So now I was actually ready for making products, like complicated products like gas turbines and so on. So I immediately told them, yeah, sure, let's do it.
Right,
Right? That's the second part. The third part
right,
was the NCCRD actually required us to solve grand challenges of practical importance. Okay, and this is something that was a mandate from the DST to give us the funding, and we had
right,
formulated these problems, and we had actually gone ahead and solved these grand challenges. And when I solved these grand challenges, at least some of them, we had this thing that, wow, this actually has a huge amount of value. We want to see it, get to the light of the day, and we want to actually push them into products. So one way of doing
Right.
this was going back to industry and then tell them, hey, we have these patents that we want to commercialize and so on. Which is also
Right.
when I realized that we were typically dealing with industry that was fairly large by nature. Like the automotive industry has sunk in millions of dollars into what they are doing. The gas turbine industry is typically a Western industry like a GE or a Siemens or any of those people,
Alstom. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Alstom or any of those people, and so
Right.
they have sunk in billions of dollars in what they're doing. The thermal power industry sets up all these huge coal power plants, which the entire plant itself is like a township, right? So
Right.
and it's like so massive. So what I felt was that it was sort of like a one-way street. They would tell us what their problems are that they want us to solve at the scales that they are interested in, which we could afford to do at NCCRD. But if
Right.
we came up with solutions, they would be like, "Oh, I think we've thought about it. It won't work, or it's not going to be easy to implement." And so on. The reason is they have actually sunk in. There's like a sunk cost effect, right? They have
Right.
sunk in money into what they are doing, and it's difficult to actually move the needle with what we had to go back with. And that's when I said, let's actually think about pushing them into our startups so that we will actually get them to see the light of day. That
Right.
was actually one major factor. So the point in all of these things is that I I have this unfortunate need for having a rationale for actually doing, going from one thing to the other, right? So I need to have some rational pull in a direction from where I am to where I have to go, right? If I have to
Right.
actually go from a Georgia Tech to a IIT Madras, there is a rational pull, and then so on. So every transition actually had this kind of like a rationalization that had to actually,
A logic gate.
right,
A logic gate to go through.
so I felt these things were happening. So
Right.
Agnikul's co-founders actually came up to me and said, "Let's do 3D printed rockets." We were actually doing 3D printed gas turbine, micro gas turbine combustors for GE at the time. So
Right.
there's a lot of these synergies that were actually happening between what we were doing at NCCRD versus what these startups wanted to do. But then ePlane happened, right? So ePlane is actually kind of like a black swan moment there, because
Right.
it was absolutely nothing to do with combustion, and in fact, it
Right.
kind of was a slap in the face for doing combustion. And yeah, so that was amazing.
Right.
Yeah,
No,
and
but I
then
think
all,
yeah.
all hell broke loose. We were doing Hyperloop, we were doing Galaxy, right? Nothing to do with combustion anymore. And I'm like, what the
Right.
heck? It's more important for us to do something that's of
Right.
societal impact, that brings technology to the table, rather
Right.
than be wedded to your past saying that I'm a combustion guy and I need to do only things that burn. Yeah.
Which also is very important, right, Professor Satya? Because I think the whole idea is that, and going back to the earlier part of the conversation when we said, it was very tough to ask questions to teachers, because you would either be shot down or you are considered as questioning their knowledge. If you happen to know a little bit more than
Oh, yeah.
them, then it is like end of your career, or even before it has even started. And so the things are that, and science tells you that, you have to back things up with data, facts, everything, and that is the holy grail for a researcher, right? Like if you look at everything has an explanation and a logic and a phenomena and deep roots in science, at least in the physical world, governed
Yeah.
by mathematics,
Yeah.
and that is what ultimately leads to products, right? So there is this transition that you talk about beautifully between science that leads to technology that leads to products.
Yeah.
And then if you go solve products without knowing the technology, it's a problem. If you try to do something with technology, you're not going to create something very deep that science will not be able to back after a point in time, and you lose that mode. So
Yeah.
this whole reason why companies continue to invest in R&D is so important, because you need to continue to push the science, your knowledge, to be able to kind of bring the next set of advancements. And then that leads to the point that you mentioned, that you have to be ready to kind of unlearn whatever
Mhm.
you may have done for 20 years. So you did combustion with gases and other materials, and then you said, okay, drop it like a hot cake for ePlane.
Correct. Absolutely. That's exactly
Right?
what it is.
So yeah. So with ePlane, I think there was again a pivotal moment in your life when you heard something on YouTube,
Yeah.
and then you decided this was it.
Correct. That's it. Yeah. I mean, I think you probably know the story, or I don't know if you want me to repeat it here.
Right, but the point is that I think you maybe in short, I want to kind of double down on that moment, right? Like you quoted as you remember the moment when you saw that video. What kind of shifted in your mind? Like what fundamentally shifted in your mind to keep the rest of your wisdom aside and say, okay, this is the place where my time as an entrepreneur, as an academic, you may still be pursuing combustion or related physics, around it, and then you're supporting things, but your own personal time, you said my mission is going to be ePlane.
Right. So that particular moment that you're talking about did not really, push me into entrepreneurship by itself.
Right.
Just pushed me into electric planes.
Electric
Right.
planes.
Right. So that was actually a Saturday, October 1st, 2016, 6 p.m. to 6:30, 6:53 p.m.
Right.
Right. Can't get more accurate with seconds level accuracy there. I went back and checked actually to find out like
It's
what
your
time.
inflection point, so might as well remember it like that.
So at the end of see, it was a very compelling video by Tony Seba, where he actually showed data and presented it in a particular fashion that made it extremely compelling and
Right.
very data driven. To point out that by 2030, the world will actually stop using combustion cars, IC engine cars, and it'll all become electric. And all of that electricity will actually come from solar, is what his claim was, backed by a way of presenting data that was very compelling,
Right.
right? Um, so at the end of it, I was asking myself, here we are actually building the world's largest combustion research center with
Right.
mainly three pillars: automotive combustion, aerospace propulsion, and
Right.
thermal power. And two out of those three pillars were actually getting knocked down in the foreseeable future of about the next 13, 14 years.
Right.
And what am I doing here? Right, I was actually safely positioned in the aerospace propulsion pillar. That's my
Right.
original training, and I was continuing to
Correct.
do my research in it.
Right.
It wasn't getting threatened by any electrification at that time. But this actually was an eye opener for me to look for what's happening around the world on electric aerospace. And then I started looking at the possibility of electric planes, and started reading up, and then so on. And within about 4 or 5 months, in fact, that night, I
Yeah.
felt that I should actually get into making electric planes, but not necessarily as an entrepreneur as such. The typical professor that I was, my typical approach was that go get funding for building an electric plane, right?
Mm.
Funding could be a government funding, like a project, or submit a proposal to a government funding agency or whatever it is,
Right.
right? That might have been how I was thinking about it. And I was not thinking about eVTOLs. I was not thinking about urban air mobility. None of those things. I just wanted to make an electric plane that takes off from a runway and lands back on a runway and so on. Simply because I just wanted to uh, embrace this new kind of propulsion that's away from combustion.
Mm.
That's essentially what was the driving force. Fast forward about 6 months, I wanted actually. So one of the things that I do is, if I get an idea, right, I have this compulsive urge to do something about it. Right, it doesn't
Mm.
make sense to just have an idea and just let it go, all right,
Yeah.
or just talk about it or talk to other people for them to pick it up and all that stuff, right? Instead, I'm like, if I have an idea, I need to do something about it, right? So
Right.
so I actually started putting together a set of students with who I could discuss what we should be doing and how we should go about it, and so on. And we also actually found that there are a lot of eVTOL companies that were happening around.
Right.
So we started ideating electric planes and eVTOLs. We
Right.
started understanding why we need to actually do eVTOLs as opposed to just a conventional electric plane.
Right.
And that's when I also actually chanced upon this book by Clayton Christensen on the innovator's dilemma. And
Mm.
it all kind of fitted in my mind as a jigsaw puzzle, that if you did eVTOLs, you are actually ushering in a new era of electric aviation for the following century. So that's the way it dawned in my head, and I still very passionately, I'm convinced that that's what we are after. Yeah.
Right.
So
So
I think
it's
going forward in the next decade or so, you will actually see airport to airport planes that would be electric. That's my gut feel and conviction. Yeah, and that
Right.
would be spawned by the eVTOL revolution that we are doing.
eVTOL revolution, right? So electric vertical takeoff and landing, and then you are always kind of fine tuning the lens with it in terms of what you can achieve. And uh, let's talk a little bit about the science behind this, right? So tell us first, because there are three things that you see in terms of aviation which are kind of considered short haul, right? Like, obviously you have the drone technology, which obviously people are talking about, delivering small packages, and defense, there are multiple scenarios. Then you have um, uh, this the helicopters, right, which is single rotor, you kind of just do point to point, different kind of scenarios. And then you have the conventional civil aircrafts. Then you also have, obviously, the defense aircrafts,
Mhm.
which are again a completely different category. So when you look at modes of transportation, these are the pieces. So when I was just looking at the video of the ePlane, I was trying to figure out whether this is a drone or a plane. So maybe talk to. I don't think I've seen anything like that. I've seen drone based motion for human beings, or aircrafts, but haven't seen a plane and a drone combined. Like, am I missing something? Am I getting it right?
No, 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 you're absolutely right. So, in fact, these were essentially the questions that I had in my mind when I was just getting exposed to the whole thing.
Hmm.
So, the basic problem with electric planes was that you wouldn't actually get the range that you want to go from one runway to another runway. Runways were not close enough for the kind of ranges that you would get with electric planes. Then the
Right.
question is, why do electric planes in the first place, right?
Right.
The answer is electric planes actually can be cheaper than the combustion planes even right off the bat, because you have a limitation in how much battery you will have to put in the plane, because otherwise it's actually going to get extremely heavy and you will not be able to
Right.
fly, right? And
Right.
batteries are actually a fair part of the cost of the plane, as opposed to engines being like about half the cost of the plane otherwise, right? So you remove
Right.
the engine, you put the battery is limited, so your cost is limited. So you can make electric planes that are cheaper than combustion planes, unlike electric cars where they pack a lot of battery to get the range that they want, and make it too expensive than when compared to the IC engine cars. And then it takes a while for the electric cars to come down in prices when compared to IC
Prices.
engine cars, because the
That's
batteries
right.
have to bring down, make it less expensive, right?
Right.
That's not the case with electric planes. Electric planes will be cheaper. Definitely, the advantage with electric cars applies to electric planes in terms of low maintenance costs and low operating costs as well. So there is this huge conviction that electric aviation will disrupt aviation completely, going into the future, right? Our ticket prices for going from, let's say, Mumbai to Delhi, or Chennai to Bangalore, will become half of what it is today, right? Just
Hmm.
because we will go electric. However, not happening anytime soon, because we don't have that kind of ranges, and
Right.
therefore we have to have vertical takeoff. The moment you actually have to have vertical takeoff, you have to have a drone-like approach, and then for you to get any decent range, you have to have a plane-like approach, because you don't want to be guzzling power running these vertical rotors all the way to balance the weight of the aircraft. Uh,
Right.
and therefore you want to go forward with generating lift on the wings and overcome only the wind resistance, or what they call as aerodynamic drag,
Right.
which actually incurs far less power when compared to the power it takes for balancing the weight of the aircraft, simply because the weight of the aircraft is equal to the lift, and the aerodynamic drag is equal to the power, the thrust that we have to overcome with the engine.
Right.
And lift to drag ratios are actually of the order of about 10. So you are actually having 10 times less force to overcome if you're using wings, when compared to if you are to actually have vertical rotors, and
Right.
corresponding the power.
Therefore, the aeroplane or aircraft design in a plane is like more efficient.
Correct. So the
Right.
question then is, the moment you have actually taken off, what are these vertical floaters doing? Are you actually carrying a dead weight? Just because you have to land? And in
Right.
aerospace, the dictum is takeoff is optional, landing is mandatory. That means that right, I have to worry about landing before I take off.
Right. Right.
uh, so, uh, what about the dead weight problem? right? That's essentially the key problem that was bothering me. And remember, I'm doing all these things from 2017 to 2019 before I actually founded the company.
Company.
That means that it's all part of the ideation, and this ideation is not about business case and all of that stuff. It's all about the science that's going to drive the tech
Right.
that's required
So
for the business.
let me pause you here for a second, because isn't that the time frame also that you taught this unique course at IIT Madras on ePlane, or I don't know what, electric propulsion,
Electric aircraft propulsion.
right? And
Yeah.
so you were doing the science around this at that point in time and also teaching.
Well, that's exactly what happens when you teach, right? So you get an opportunity to think through things because you're teaching, right?
Right.
I mean, to be a professor at the level of an IIT is actually super because the teaching aids the research and vice versa. They kind of like go together,
Right.
right? They
Right.
kind of like build up to a upward spiral.
So
Like
you
you can,
kind of, to know that new space that you were getting into, a based on that moment that you had, you actually defined your own personal milestone, and one of those goals was to say be able to deliver a curriculum
true. I
for
actually had to, yeah,
this.
because back then there was absolutely no material. There's no textbooks, right?
Right.
So I got to put together the entire curriculum for that course and pass it through the Senate. And that
Right.
means that chapter after chapter, I had actually pattern after specific research papers that had been not even published in journals at the time. They were actually only presented in
Right.
conferences. Yeah,
Right. So this is in parallel to the startup world. This is like pre your product market fit. You're defining the science, and
yeah,
so you are creating a new product
yeah.
before your end product and selling it to a different audience to kind of reach to your ultimate goal of creating a plane.
Nicely put.
So that is essentially what it is. So I think these are those small battles before you can win the war.
Absolutely.
So, and that became, so your, I think it just very beautifully relates to your logical mind. You had kind of made that step, so you personally challenged yourself to learn more about this subject by researching and then also teaching.
Yeah, so 2018 is when I actually went on a teaching sabbatical to learn more about electric planes. And that resulted in me teaching the electric aircraft propulsion course twice in that year, back to back. Normally, I don't
Right.
teach the same course back to back in two successive semesters, but I wanted to really hone myself
Right.
and did that. In fact, the second
And
time around, we even
yeah,
videotaped the whole thing because I thought that it will actually be useful for the posterity.
for the next
Just,
generation.
just not put it out on YouTube
and
because
and you did the whole 9 yards, I'm assuming, for this, which is basically attend conferences, maybe find that rocket science kind of professor who's the best in their field, what science is happening, read maybe 1,000 papers,
yes.
figure the whole thing out.
I had like a huge repository of papers that I had to comb through and sequence them in the sequence of what is the most basic paper in this field, which was again only about a few years before, right? Because the entire field is so nascent, and from
Right.
there we had to actually look at what is the next more complicated paper and the next more complicated
Right.
paper to imbibe and then develop this course
Right.
curriculum and teach.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Imagine doing this like when internet was not available. Today the internet is available,
absolutely, absolutely.
and now we are able to kind of rip the whole deep
Correct. And
seek
then, and
paper
then
in like
yeah,
5 dimensions,
and just one point to
real
make
time.
between the time I actually joined IIT Madras, where it was difficult to have access to international journal papers.
Right.
Fast forward 10 years, I think Indian institutions, and even now it's even better. Indian institutions actually had access to pretty much all journal papers by late 2000s. So
Right.
we
Right.
have been fortunate that way in terms of
So
access to
I know
resources.
I know we are digressing a bit, but just one last point on this particular piece. Like, would you? So I think people who are building deep tech businesses based on hard science, they need to kind of be in this habit of continuously upgrading themselves by reading scientific journals, even if they are. It's kind of almost doing like a peer review
Yeah.
of a paper to that level of detail to be able to say, okay, now this is something that is going to be helping my cause.
I've been in the business of doing peer review all the time, right?
Right.
So that is actually the cutting edge of being at the cutting edge of science because you get access to what's yet to be published, and then
Right.
you get
Right.
to comment on it and stuff. Yeah.
Right. And that is why, in a field like AI right now, half of the entrepreneurs, or even more than half of the entrepreneurs, or people of influence like Jan LeCun at Facebook, they've all been academicians and researchers in the past, and are now transitioned beautifully to kind of create real world products or support real world products.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So maybe coming back to Professor Satya on that ePlane story, right?
Right. So we were talking about the dead weight problem. Okay.
That's
So
right. That's
the
right.
way I'm actually positioning it is as if it's a mathematical problem, like a professor would do. Right.
Right.
The point essentially is, what do these vertical rotors do? And a few of them were actually trying to implement the idea of tilt rotors. And then I found that that was so. I don't like moving parts, by the way, right? So I'm actually coming from a solid rocket background, right, with the oldest rocket scientist for my PhD advisor.
Right.
And even before that, even in my bachelor's, I was actually getting into solid rockets. Solid
Right.
rockets has no moving parts. It's
Right.
just glorified Diwali rocket for you, right? So you
Yes.
light it up and it just goes, right? So the only thing that
Right.
moves is the gas from inside to outside. So I
That's right.
really like no moving parts. The moment you have to actually tilt these rotors, I'm like, yuck, there's something wrong with it, right? So it just doesn't intuitively. What does exactly translate to in hard facts is you have to have a huge certification problem to confront with having to show reliability of what could otherwise be a single point of failure, right? That is number one.
So every
Second,
component that fits into that mechanical moving part, you have to
if it is a single point
run
of
through
failure,
regulations.
if it is a single point of failure, because there is absolutely no alternative to it, all right,
Right.
while doing this, there are no redundancies to it and so on. That means that you have to show that that particular movement is going to be so reliable that it will fail only in 1 in a billion chances. Okay. And
Right.
that's super difficult for any mechanical movement. And the second problem is to figure out the flight dynamics of it. When it's actually tilting, you're losing lift because
Stability and yeah.
right. So and then it starts falling down. And so how do you actually figure out a lack of preventing loss of altitude while you do this tilt and then rev up again and so on? So all of these things were quickly running in my mind and said, I don't want to do that. I want to actually have separate forward rotors and separate vertical rotors that will give me sufficient redundancy. There are two ways of holding the plane up in the air
Right.
and so on. So that essentially meant that I was actually carrying more dead weight. But in reality, you need only 1 out of 10 propellers to tilt as opposed to all of them tilting or whatever. So you're not utilizing these vertical rotors completely, even if you're tilting. So you have a dead weight problem to deal with. So that's when I realized, is there a way by which I can actually get the vertical rotors to help me in the forward flight? Right, and then that would then so what are the consequence of that? I could actually make my wings extremely compact, and I can also fly very, very slowly. That will guzzle
Mhm.
much less power, and I can then land my planes in very tight spaces and do much shorter distances, even though I have wings that will allow me to do very long distances in a single charge, which means that will
Right.
translate to multiple short hops before I have a downtime charging. So the asset utilization of the aircraft per day will actually be super maximized. So all of the business case for a air taxi, the ideal air taxi like behavior is rooted in the science of how am I utilizing the vertical rotors in forward flight to energize the wing to operate with a very compact size and slow flight.
So it's like
That's
you kind of, in simple terms, correct me if I'm wrong. It's like just adjusting the two rotors to help you kind of glide better,
the adjustment is actually so simple as just get it to the right lower level of speed of
low level of speed.
running without actually any other mechanical movement.
Fantastic. And is this comparable to what the current thinking in eVTOLs or yeah, is kind of in the world? Like, is it how like most of the other companies that are doing this trying to do this thinking, or is this like very unique?
Very unique. It's still very unique. I've not really seen anybody else talk about it as late as last May when I was in Bali for a international conference of regulators on eVTOLs. There
Right.
was uh, there was somebody who actually I was telling them that the metric that we should be looking for is maximizing the number of short trips in a single charge, even if you
Right.
have one long trip that's possible in a single charge. And that lady
Right.
was like, oh right, that's exactly what we should be doing. And I'm like, hey, that's what a taxi does on the road, and wouldn't you want to I didn't respond immediately, but I was
Right.
actually surprised that she was surprised, right?
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
So in this, just kind of again doubling down on this particular concept, right? So there is, what kind of fields of engineering and science are now getting involved in the construction of the e-plane, right? Like just
Right.
for our
Right.
audiences.
Right. So if you were to actually think about it as a conventional plane building, but electric, right? You
Right.
would think all the previous knowledge about aerodynamics and the aircraft structures,
Aeronautics or
and
whatever.
flight
Right.
dynamics, all the aeronautical stuff is pretty much the same.
Right.
Um, but then we have to actually focus on the batteries and the motor, and maybe the right, even the propellers are pretty much the same. So all you have to do is to actually get better batteries, right?
Right.
Now that's actually so wrong.
Right.
The reason is, if you were to actually think like that, your electric plane will actually remain primitive for a very long time. Um, so you have to think of the entire plane as a whole and ask questions. How can I actually get my aerodynamics to be a 21st century, aerodynamics? How do I get my aircraft structural design to be a 21st century structure? How do I get my flight mechanics to be the 21st century level, and so on? When I say 21st century, the point I'm making is at the
Cutting
level
edge
of,
in that space.
well, the reason I specifically said 21st century instead of just using cutting edge is because if you look at what is actually a flying four-seater today, it's probably like a Cessna 182 Skylane, all right,
Right.
and that's been designed in the 70s or 80s, and then it's kind of going through its run, right? There isn't much of like a production-based aerospace design that's actually extremely novel
Right.
today. So that's
Right.
exactly why I'm saying that we need to fast forward and do a lot of aerospace engineering that's 21st century, which you improve your aerodynamics, you improve your lightweighting, you improve your flight dynamics, and then say, well, after all these things, if I can actually get a better battery, that'll be great, right?
Right.
Or put it another way, even if I actually don't have the best battery, I should
Right.
actually be able to improve my performance by focusing on all the conventional ones to make it the most cutting edge.
Right. So even for like things like battery tech, right? So are you thinking first principles to design like your own battery pack for ePlane?
Well, at the moment, we are actually doing first principles battery pack design, but with cells that are off the shelf
Off the
um,
shelf.
right now. But we are also actually working on new battery chemistries that could actually give us cells that we are developing by ourselves, and then the pack.
Right.
We are,
Right.
we are working on it, but at the moment, for the first planes that we will make, it will be actually off the shelf cells with which we make ab initio battery packs.
Right. Right. In a way, like I'm thinking, even when you look at, like you said, you question everything in the conventional
Yeah,
design,
correct,
and you kind of break it down to a component level, even to the
correct.
material of what this aircraft is made of, to kind of make it super lightweight. And in that direction, you talk, you had a recent milestone that you kind of hit with the propeller design, right?
Hmm.
Maybe share a little bit about that. And what I was fascinated about was that 2% cost kind of equation that you just solved for that propeller design. So maybe just like, can you explain to the
Well,
audience?
there are two parts to the story. One is the design itself, and then
Right.
the way we actually do design today is to uh, start with the science, as we have been talking about in the last couple of hours,
Right.
and go back to the textbook, figure out what it says, write out the equations, maybe develop a MATLAB code that solves those equations together, get a basic design out of the textbook,
Right.
but then run it through complex computational fluid dynamic simulations with
Simulations. Right.
software,
Right.
and then try to hone it much better and better. We started doing this as far back as, let's say 2020, right?
Hmm.
And then what we found was that the so we are the way to actually validate our approach is to pick a geometry that's been published in the literature, and simulate it, and then find out like what results we get, and then how does it compare with the published data from experiments. What we found was that, of course, when we now look at the literature is giving us a geometry that has been simulated upon, as well as comparing it with the experimental data. So we have past simulations from others as well as the experimental data that they have compared, and found
Right.
it to be fairly lousy to begin with. And
Right.
we found that we were also lousy enough, right? Just about as lousy, right? So we had like about a 30%, 40% errors,
Right.
and we weren't alone. So we actually dug up more and more literature and found that there are about 80 papers that were actually reporting lousy results, right?
Hmm.
And this was kind of like accepted, saying that yeah, propellers will actually give lousy results in terms of
So
simulations
there was
to
this like theoretical ceiling and a limit to what this could get you.
correct. right?
Hmm.
And this is something that I was completely unaware of. Right? I thought like propellers must be done and dusted, right? So it's like such a
Right.
simple
It's been
thing.
around for so many
Yeah,
years,
and I've
decades.
come across like combustion of jet engines and all those things, right? Rockets and
Right.
all this stuff. This must be like cool. I mean, just turn something and then. No, I'm completely wrong, right? So no, nobody was paying
Wow.
attention to it, right? Because it was all like the 1970s stuff, and right,
Right.
there was not much research done. Maybe I don't know, right?
In the
So
current context. Yeah.
correct. Right. So then we had to actually sit up and say, hey, wait a minute, we had to do something about this. Right. And then
Hmm.
we started tweaking every little parameter, every little step that we have to take, every process that we have to follow in the simulations, right? Get the meshing right, very tight around the walls, right? Get the exact geometry and, leave no stone unturned to get this simulation exact. And we could narrow down the gap between theory and experiment to about 3%, which is kind of best in class, right?
Wow.
And then we went and actually did the propeller design for the E200 and made the propeller and went and put it in the wind tunnel and got the data for our geometry, and we found exactly right on top of each other, right?
Wow.
So that's actually the culmination of like a lot of work that's been done, very very systematically, right?
Right.
But while there, when we were making the propeller, we discovered one more fascinating thing about what we were doing, which is to be able to do this at 2% of the cost of acquiring a propeller. And this is for an off-the-shelf propeller if you have to actually buy, versus if you have to recreate that propeller, right? You would have
With
to
your
actually,
geometry and design. Yeah.
yeah, we had to spend about 1 lakh rupees in the market, whereas we could actually do it out of 2,000 rupees. Yeah.
Wow.
So
Wow.
and that's the power of Indian frugal engineering development that we have actually had first-hand experience of. This is just
Right.
one anecdote. Yeah,
Right. I think the frugal is an advantage that you can, I think, put on top of fundamental knowledge.
absolutely.
I think that's the killer edge of India,
Frugalities,
right?
frugalities,
You
not.
can't change the mathematics, you can't change the physics. You still have to do that hard work.
Yeah, yeah.
But then you can put the frugal angle on top and say, hey, I'm going to take it to the next level,
No,
which is what happened in
I'm extremely
all
clear.
our ISRO missions as well.
When Naval Ravikant actually invested upon us, right?
Right.
He said there are three things going for us, right? And
Right.
and it's important why to listen to investors on why they are investing in us, right? Do not just
Yeah.
take them,
Absolutely.
right? So he basically said that you have some globally competitive tech, and that's actually the most fundamental thing. It's not the frugality. The
That's
second
right.
thing is actually the frugality, the amount
Right.
of money that you
Yeah.
have to actually get
Yeah.
for
If
achieving.
it's not great, frugality is not going to get you anywhere. So,
You're
forget
simply saying that
frugality for a while.
you're not one of those guys who is actually copying what's been done somewhere
Right,
else.
right. I
Right?
think
You're
that's
doing
the
something.
limiting factor. That is the mentality that we talked about, right? Like everything we want to do frugal. We want to say, okay, we'll do it like one fifth the cost, and we feel that this is fantastic, but it
That's
is
not
not best in
that's not
class.
the
It's
thing
not
at all.
cutting edge. It's not
Yeah.
21st century.
That's not the thing at all, right?
That's
So,
right.
in fact, the tech we have to develop should help us be frugal even more than what we would normally be, right? It
Right,
kind of like doubles down there,
right,
right? So, we have to actually develop that tech that will allow you to be more frugal than what you would normally be. That really beats the competition hollow, right? With the superior
right,
tech and the greater frugality. So these two
right,
combinations are actually a deadly combination. The third thing that
right,
he said was, at the end of all of these things, when this is actually coming out of India, it's going to be like a wow moment, and I want to be
right.
part of. That will actually become like world famous, and I want to be part of that journey and that story, right?
Wow,
So
wow,
these
wow.
are the three things that are stacking up for us.
Right. And just on that, taking the cue from what you discussed with Naval, right? I'm sure to kind of say that this is world class science. He also has spent a lot of time going through it. Are investors kind of spending that quality of time going into the science behind the whole thing these days, or are they still kind of far and few in number? Because I think to be able to take a technology risk and understand where this is going to go, right? So if I look at the ePlane journey, let's say ePlane becomes a very big company like Tesla, right? You would want to kind of go back to the fundamental discoveries and changes to this point where we are discussing right now on the E200X with the 2% efficiency with the new geometry on the propeller. And we'll reflect back on that as one of the pivotal moments why this happened,
Mhm.
right? So is it something that the investors are able to visualize? Because I think what they look at is this larger number, addressable market, conventional way of building a product, and it'll kind of get there. and they have to kind of trust the entrepreneur, or let's say the scientist or the deep tech researcher in the middle, to be able to get there. But they also have to, I think, acknowledge that there will be many, many, many mini milestones before you can reach to a certain destination.
Correct. Well,
Right.
the way my experiences with entrepreneurship as well as investors is, there is no science to it. Okay. Entrepreneurship is actually driven by passion.
Right.
So most entrepreneurs do it just because they love it. So they are expected to hustle what they are doing. So they may or may not have thought through if that is actually the right thing to do at all in the first place.
Right.
But they get validated if they are able to get an investor interest, get funding. So many times in deep tech, particularly, and not just deep tech, and other entrepreneurship as well, getting investor money is half the victory for most entrepreneurs, right?
Right.
So people get intoxicated by getting other people's money,
Right.
and so on, right?
Right.
uh, and all of that stuff is just passion, right? There is not much of a rationale about it as such,
Right.
while you're particularly hustling and so on.
Right.
Most people are not exactly as data driven as we would like. And very similarly, uh, investors, right? If they like a startup, if they like the founder, if they like the team, if they like the product, if they like the idea, they will actually, double down, deep dive, and find out like what the tech is all about, what is the science behind it, and all of those things. But if they are not, they will not pay attention,
Right.
right? So it's kind of like a confirmation bias. If they want to, if they're interested, they will deep dive and then learn. If they are not interested, they will not deep dive and they won't learn, which is
Right.
okay. That's how it has to be.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Right, right. No, no, absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's also kind of contingent upon, like you said, you wake up every day excited to kind of solve that problem. And as
yeah.
long as that sincerity comes through, I think investors are going to kind
Yeah,
of
over time.
continue to
So,
support
I mean,
that,
it throws me back to how I was actually doggedly pursuing bureaucrats for getting the NCCRD funding,
getting the
or
NCCRD.
right,
Yeah,
or the COPT
yeah,
funding, right? It's as simple as that.
right,
You do your job, you just keep doggedly at it, right? You're passionate about what you're doing. While you're passionate, you're also actually data
right,
driven. You have data to back your
right,
passion, right? You're actually going and getting that data,
right,
clocking those milestones, right? There is just no other alternative I can see,
right,
to do this. Yeah,
right, 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 right. So just to kind of also unpack this element for our audience on how you kind of building the ePlane company, right? Like tell us a little bit about the team, right? The team, the composition, the talent, the skills that folks bring in, and then the
yeah.
follow up to that would be like what are the ideal characteristics of people who want to aspire to kind of work for ePlane.
Right. So I think it's a fantastic question that you asked. I think it doesn't really get asked too much. I mean, as a general question, not just particular pertaining to me, but I have to actually go back to having set up the NCCRD, for example, right? So at the height of NCCRD, when we were all done and dusted and setting it up and going, we had like about 100 plus PhD students. We had about 20, 30 faculty members. It was bigger than a typical department at IIT by itself, but completely interdisciplinary.
Wow, that number itself is like a gold mine. When you say 100 PhD students in NCCRD involved, it's like a mind blowing number.
And the number of projects that we were doing, like it's for some 40 to 50 projects with about some 15 different companies, and the amount of money that was actually involved was like in hundreds of crores, right, of rupees,
Right,
or like tens of millions of dollars,
right,
whatever. The scale was really mind
right,
boggling. So what I had realized was
right,
that you're not doing all these things by yourself. You need to actually have an organizational backing. You have to develop that organization, and so on. So it kind of building the company now, having stepped into entrepreneurship, kind of became natural, except that instead of using like a public funding that I got, I'm actually using investor funding. That's the only difference, right? So, but
right,
the money sits in
right,
a different bank, right? But you just have to spend it pretty much the same way as doing like a mega project. So one thing that I
right.
clearly realized was, it's one thing to be building a plane, and completely another thing to actually build a plane company, right? It's one thing to be building a rocket.
Mm,
It's another thing to be building a rocket company. They're
right,
two different things, right?
right.
If you want to be
Yeah,
building a plane company, it's completely fine if you don't know how to build a plane, right? If you knew how to build a plane, doesn't mean that you will know how to build a plane company, right? So you have to actually wear two different hats at the same time and focus on plane building because that's what you're delivering for your investor. But the investor is actually there to exit, right? You're the one who is actually supposed to take the company along. So it's at the back of your mind, you always have to worry about what am I doing to actually build my company as much as I'm actually building the product, right? And this is as much
Right.
a step-by-step product process as building the plane itself.
Right.
And this happens over time, and you nucleate the most important employees to begin with, and then get them to buy into your vision and hold them tight as a core team for long, and get them to come along, get them involved in the process of hiring more people, own up to their hires, and build their teams. Um, Train them and coach them to work on team building by themselves instead of just being individual
Right.
contributors. That doesn't come naturally to most people, right? You have to actually work on them
Right.
to build those teams, and
Right.
then you also actually then have
Right.
to slap the top management and get into more governance, clean governance, because startups actually are not very good at governance. I mean, in fact, in India,
Right.
the problem
Processes.
is,
I would say governance is there, but processes are not there. Right.
so governance is actually kind of
Yeah.
imposed by, let's say, Ministry of Company Affairs or something. You have to do the filing, compliance, and all those things. But the
Filing. Yeah.
processes to
Yeah.
get there,
Right.
right?
Right.
You're absolutely right. The processes to get there, make it clean, always like MIS every month, right? All of those things have to actually be tidy, right? So that we are, I mean, on any day, I should actually, in clean conscience, say I'm actually, my processes are such that I'm ready for an IPO, right? But my product is not yet
Right.
there. It has to scale, and that's when I will do. So it's as important
Right.
to focus on the company building as much as the product building is what I would say. Yeah,
Right. Right.
because
Right. Right.
we are
And just
developing
like on yeah.
we are developing legacy products. We are
Right.
developing
Right.
legacy companies.
You're yeah. Right, right, right. So what I was asking was also this, right? Like, what is the team composition of ePlane company like? Like, how many engineers from mechanical? Like, you want the less number of mechanical parts. I'm assuming there are less number of mechanical engineers, but there's still something there. There are
Less
maybe
number,
material
less
science
number of moving
engineers, which are
parts.
kind of,
Less number of moving parts, not
huh?
necessarily mechanical parts, right? So,
Less number
so
of moving parts. Right. That's right. That's right. So like I'm trying to figure out that composition of the team, right? So if there are younger students or younger engineering students who are wanting to get into contributing to the ePlane company, like what kind of roles they can find if they are coming from, let's say, computer science or electronics design, because you need probably onboard, you're thinking autonomous at some point in time. So it's like literally the whole software has to be written for the ePlane, like it is written for Tesla, and then you may be having over the air updates at some point in time in life, like the Tesla gets updated, right? So who are the people who will kind of make this ecosystem right now for you?
very interesting. In fact, we have been actually working on autonomy right from day one, right? In fact, our website is
Hmm.
eplane.ai because we want to actually
Right.
ultimately make autonomous planes. The reason why we are not doing autonomous planes is because of public acceptance and regulations, right? But we are ready to make autonomous planes anytime. And right now, we are actually converting the
Hmm.
autonomy features as pilot assist features, just to stick to regulations. But ultimately, we want the situation
Right.
where the passenger is actually watching the pilot do nothing, and then ask the question, "Why am I paying this guy?" Right? And we then have to have public acceptance for the aircraft to fly by itself, and so on. So, but those days may not be far away once we actually start flying multiple planes with pilots, right? So we are autonomous right from day one, right? And then that's actually been put
Right.
out in our unmanned aircraft, first of all, right? So our composition is we are somewhere between 120 to 150 people. The reason why we have that gap is about 20 to 30 of them would actually be just about a few of them as consultants, like people retired from HAL or those places who have made planes, built tech and all that stuff, who are assisting our engineers. But we also actually have a large number of
Right.
interns who are actually still in college. And those interns are important because one of the factors that we actually, one of the metrics that we continue to look for month on month is what is my interns to employee conversion ratio, right? Am I able to actually
Hmm.
keep enough interest from the interns to be able to convert them to employees, right? So we actually keep following that
Right.
metric. The other metric that we obviously follow is
Wow.
gender ratio, right? We want to actually push towards 20% women. We have been consistently growing
Right.
from 20, now clocking 16, so we're heading there. Another way of actually doing both is to actually get girls as interns and get them to convert. So actually, both these metrics actually grow. So these are all things that we actually pay attention to.
Right.
So on the whole, we have around 115 to 120 full-time employees as of today. And the mix
Right.
is actually people with anywhere between 6 to 15 years of experience in the aerospace industry, as about 50% of them. The remaining 50% is anywhere between fresh out of college to about 3 to 6 years of experience in the aero industry, and so on. So it's a combination of people in their 40s versus people in their 20s, and some of them in the 30s, and so on. So we value fresh out of college engineers as much as these experienced people, and it's a very eclectic group
Right.
because people with experience actually defer to people who are fresh minded, because we are fascinated by young people as much as we value the experience. So it's a beautiful team. The way they actually
Right.
work together. There is a bro code going
Right. Right.
between a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old. Right, they all kind of hang out
Right.
together and all that stuff. It's amazing.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. Just a small follow up on that, because I think this is again very fascinating, because you said there's this bro code and there are these mentors, and I can see the success has happened for example for Agnikul, where a lot of our ISRO
yeah, yeah.
scientists have helped get them moving forward, through all the milestones. Is there like a different culture, like a research oriented culture inside ePlane? Do you think, like, because I think some of the problems are you're solving in the world for the first time, so there is no precedent of a process. So I'm assuming that the intern or the employees are sometimes expected to kind of do their own research and study and then come back and say, hey, this is what we want to do as a team, right?
No, I
is
think
that is that culture existing?
true, true. So sometimes some of our existing investors worry that we could actually just be an R&D company, right? So we have to actually tell them, no, 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 we are actually
Yeah.
making progress towards the product. So the answer on how we balance is
Right.
to actually do just the required amount of research that will get us to the product, right? And then we will have some guys working on
Hmm.
the product in the front line, and there are other guys who are actually backing them with the research data that validates what they are doing. So it's always a combination. We have to
Right.
actually tread these two
So it's
tracks,
like
travel
purposeful
separately. Correct.
purposeful research.
Absolutely. In
Right.
fact,
Right. Right. No, that
having
is
been a
great. That is
professor
great.
many times, I am the one who actually spoke on why are you doing too much research.
Yeah. Right. Right. Got it, Professor Satya. So just one, like, couple of just maybe final questions on this, right? Like, so there is this fantastic view that we got of what ePlane company is turning out to be, and how you're kind of building it. And then you know I want to kind of now take you a little up level, not wanting to talk about the other companies in detail, but there is this concept that you once shared called Defrastructure, right? Where companies like Tutor, Hyperloop, Astro Villas, X2E, Galaxy, Agnikul, you kind
Yeah.
of ePlane, and then they kind of all come into some kind of a combination, right? Like, what? Just explain to me that concept a little bit.
Well, the idea was actually intuitive, but it didn't crystallize until we kind of thought back on what we were doing, and there was like a common strand across all of them.
Right.
And that's when the notion or the concept or the term called infrastructure got coined. And I used to actually always feel that as Indians we were challenged for not having infrastructure, and I was like,
Right.
well, there must be some other way of doing this, right? And what we were doing, right? So think about it. We started with grand challenges that had to be actually put into products, and uh, big companies were not actually wanting to take these innovations and adopt. Therefore, we were putting them into startups. Startups cannot make these very big products. We can't start up a GE. We cannot start up a what do you call BHEL or the thermal power, and so on, right? So
Right.
uh, we have to actually make small engines. We have to make small rockets. We have to make small planes. We have to have small launch pads. We have to have small vertiports. We can't have large airports, and we can't have large runways. Lots of things have to actually be small. Then the question is, who cares about these small products? Are there markets for these? Right? What is the problem that we're solving? Who are the customers? And what is the customer base? What is the market size of that kind of customers, that clientele? Right? All of that stuff has to actually fit in for a good product market fit. And then we realized that if you have to now do all of these small ones and then still make an impact, the answer is
Yeah.
it's going to happen only if you are able to deploy large numbers of these small products. And that's how we are actually going to get the scale
Right.
that we want. And we will then be able to make the same kind of impact as big infrastructure would do. And that's when it kind of dawned on me
Right.
that we are actually doing what's called as Defrastructure.
Got it. Got it. No, no, very fascinating. Fascinating as a concept, and I think you're doing I think, a brilliant job in just balancing how you're supporting all of these companies to kind of move the needle forward, and then also kind of focusing on ePlane to kind of just build something new and fantastic for the world. No, this has been a masterclass, Professor Satya, on so many dimensions, and I think, as you can probably gather, that part of the objective of Double Down is to also just like demystify a lot of things to make them more real, because I think in abstract we talk a lot always, but this format allows us to kind of go deep, and we were able to kind of get a little insight into your thinking and thought process. And I think you just kind of rekindled so much of fascination about the academia, research, and industry and product integration. Just a perfect example for the world to follow. So really, really thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing this masterclass. And look forward to seeing you soon, and actually seeing the be able to kind of get onto the EP plane in action, ePlane in action soon.
Sure.
So thank you so much, Professor Satya, for spending these couple of hours with us.
Thanks a lot. Thank you so much for having me.